When the earthquake hit the coast, seismic sensors triggered the insertion of control rods. Although fission reactions stopped, the residual heat had to be removed. The off-site power supply was lost, and the emergency diesel generators took over automatically. They supply electricity to the backup systems needed for core cooling. In reactors 2 and 3, it is a turbopump. The steam generated by the reactor operates the turbopump, which feeds water into the reactor vessel. The steam is condensed in the wet well suppression pool within the containment. In reactor 1, there was no turbopump, but a heat exchanger, which condensed steam from the reactor vessel. The condensed water was reintroduced into the reactor vessel by gravity. This heat exchanger provided core cooling by natural convection for more than 10 hours. Until then, everything seemed under control. However, reactor 1, due to excessive cooling, forced the operators to temporarily isolate the heat exchanger in compliance with operating procedures. The tsunami wave arrived less than an hour after the earthquake. The waves went over the seawall, flooding the lower parts of buildings and disabled the emergency diesel generators. On reactor 1, the operator was unable to reactivate the heat exchanger. The core was no longer cooled. It would be the first to melt. On units 2 and 3, the batteries were still operational. They operated some of the valves. The turbine-driven pumps ran for nearly 24 hours and then stopped. The cores were no longer cooled. The meltdown scenario is almost the same in all 3 reactors, only the dates change. The water in the reactor vessel evaporated. The fuel became uncovered. Heated up to a temperature of 2,300 degrees Celsius, the fuel melted and mixed with the materials from the structure to form a magma called corium. The corium flowed down to the bottom of the reactor vessel. According to Japanese officials, it pierced the reactor vessel before falling on the concrete basemat inside the containment. What quantity of corium fell? How deep did it erode the concrete? Did it pierce the steel liner? Even today, it is not possible to learn more about the state of the corium in the 3 reactors. At the same time, still in the reactor vessel, the steam was loaded with radioactive elements and hydrogen. To explain this phenomenon, let's have a look at the early stages of fuel degradation. Heated at high temperature, the fuel cladding is oxidized and cracks, releasing volatile radioactive elements. In addition to this, the zirconium of the fuel clad created a reaction with the steam by absorbing the oxygen and by releasing hydrogen. Normally, when mixed with air, hydrogen catches fire and explodes. However, the containment building was filled with nitrogen, an inert gas that avoids the presence of oxygen. At this stage, there was no risk. As the steam pressure rose to a dangerous level in the reactor vessel, the depressurizing valves opened. Gas was forced into the wet well suppression pool by a venting line. The water acted as an efficient filter by trapping much of the radioactive elements. But the water was no longer cooled because the emergency diesel generators were out of order, and it soon began to boil, thereby reducing its filtration capacity. The wet well suppression pool and the communicating containment began to enter into an overpressure situation. To avoid containment rupture, the operator decided to release the gas into the atmosphere. Normally, the venting line should have led all the gas outside the building by the chimney of the plant. But hydrogen was escaping through uncontrolled leakage pathways and was released into the reactor building. Hydrogen reacts violently with oxygen in the air. The explosion blew apart the frame at the top of the building, apparently without damaging the containment building. Radioactive elements not yet trapped in the wet well suppression pool were released into the environment. Due to the absence of usable fresh water on the site, the operators decided to inject seawater into the reactor vessel. This solution, far from ideal, since salt is chemically active, had at least the advantage of cooling and stabilizing the corium. In the 4 days following the tsunami, the 4 reactors were damaged by explosions, and 3 of them with core melt. Although it has kept its structure intact, Reactor 2 is the current source of the most important radioactive releases into the soil as well as into the sea. The explosion took place inside the building. Operators have probably encountered difficulties depressurizing the containment, and the wet well suppression pool broke. This loss of leak tightness led to the discharge into the atmosphere of unfiltered radioactive elements and to the spreading of highly contaminated water in the buildings, leading to highly polluting discharges into the sea. The explosion of Reactor 4 was due to hydrogen, even though the core was completely unloaded. The hydrogen came from Reactor 3 via a joint pipe. The reactor's storage pools were also a great concern because they had lost their cooling systems, and in addition to this, they were not protected by any containment. Very little spent fuel was stored in Pool 1. However, there was much more in Pools 2, 3, and 4, especially Pool 4, which contained the equivalent of the 3 cores. In all 3 pools, the water started to boil, and without the help in extremis of cold water from helicopters and from a fire hose, the spent fuel would have caused considerable radioactive release into the environment.